Braemarnia Project came about from me going over to Braemar for several years to teach creative writing at the Creative Arts Festival. And what I found was these wonderful local writers were coming and they were telling their story, their community story, their family story, stories they'd heard, and they were fictionalizing them, turning them into short stories, poems, flash fiction, novels, memoirs. And I thought, well, can't we make this bigger? Rather than working in their little individual pockets, let's bring it together to a community written novel. So the first step was to go around the community, go around Braemar, go around the area, and get stories. And the theme was, there is no theme. You could give me a story from hundreds of years ago to something that happened last week, to just a moment in time or a description or a full-blown discussion of a story. And I thought it was lovely pulling all these things together. And by the end, I had 96 stories from about 50 people around Braemar.
A note gathered in February 2019. As a child, we spent our summers on the Dee. We'd lash tractor tires together or go fishing. I remember how wet and slippery the rocks were, like oil.
The step after that was to weave them together into a fictional novel, and that wasn't easy because we were dealing with things that go back hundreds of years to things that happened about a year ago. But we did it. We managed to weave it together.
Notes from the novel outline. They are pages from old diaries, wills, notices and accounts of legends. Some papers are only a few years old, while others date back several hundreds. Local archivist Liz Murray gathers the papers and quickly discovers that they all have one thing in common.
The step after that was to write up each scene as a little outline and give that outline to 10 volunteers. Volunteers who have decided they're going to be the ones to put the words on the page. Although there's one thing that I noticed as I was gathering these stories, and that was the environment. Whether it was the rock pools in the Dee, fog coming over the mountains, stories from the mountain rescue, this was the common theme that linked them all.
Well, my childhood was spent 3 miles out of the village in Braemar, sort of in the middle of nowhere. So we just had a wonderful, wonderful time growing up, and there were no restrictions whatsoever. And, you know, in the summer holidays, my brother and I and the rest of our friends used to just go on our bikes with a picnic. And none of us had watches or times or anything. And we just used to come back home when we were hungry, because it was such a wonderful environment to grow up in. And we used to go fishing in the river and climb trees and do all sorts of things. And we had a really idyllic childhood, I have to say. And that's one of the reasons I came back to have my children back in the village, because I wanted them to have the same environment as I'd grown up in. I absolutely love it at the moment because the leaves are just coming out on the trees, and once all the trees are out and the spring fresh greens are just absolutely amazing, and the different shades of greens, incredible, really. You know, you think green is green, but it isn't. When you see all the different types of trees, the beech trees and the fir trees and the sycamores and all, they all have a slightly different colour of green leaf, and it is quite stunning. And then, of course, in the autumn again, it's just incredible. If we're lucky and don't get too many high winds in the autumn, we have all these wonderful colours for weeks on end.
I would say winter, always winter, because it's so pretty, and I love taking photographs all the time. Very cold frosts, and you get beautiful sunny days. And you just pile on the clothes, turn up the heating in your house, and, you know, it's the most wonderful place to live.
One of the main characters of the novel is a newcomer to the area. Liz had just come out of her first winter in Braemar. Having been raised in Glasgow, she embraced country life. The dark nights in by the fire and the cold frosts on sunny days. One afternoon in January, not long after she had arrived, her neighbour, a kid of about 10, talked her into going sledging. The sun reflecting off the snow, she finished that day with a sunburn across her cheeks. It was now late April, and the glen was in the depths of spring. The white and grey had been replaced with yellow daffodils and broom, and greens of all different shades. She never knew there could be so many different kinds of one colour. The locals warned of climate change, that enjoying such an early spring would come at a cost.
One story that came to mind was from Shona Armstrong. She was going up the mountain as part of the mountain rescue, and it really stood out.
When I was in mountain rescue in the Braemar Mountain Rescue Team in June 2005, I was awoken in the middle of the night. I think it was about 2:30 in the morning, from a very deep sleep to a voice from one of the team leaders, and he briefly told me that there'd been some girls that had got into difficulties, and could I lend a hand to help them to sort things out. So I literally had to jump out of bed, try and wake myself up, throw on my clothes, which were what I'd been wearing the day before, and I think I grabbed a small rucksack and rushed out, because within minutes the Land Rover drew up and two of the team members from the same village came to pick me up. The brief conversation, I had assumed that I was being called to help with the girls at the girls in difficulty at the rescue centre. However, it soon transpired that we were actually going on a call out to a site quite near Braemar on an estate. And the Land Rover just shot out the village and drove onto the estate, and then started to go up this Land Rover track, really remote on the estate. I sort of realised that I hadn't really brought my full sort of team kit and my rucksack. I hadn't really been prepared, which was not good in retrospect. We drove up as far as we could in the Land Rover, just the three of us, and the road was very, very disused, very rocky and very pitted, so it was very difficult to get very far up the track. However, the guys I was with drove as far up the track as they could. Maybe drove up for about 1.5 miles, 2 miles up this very rough track, but it came to a point where you couldn't go any further with the vehicle. It simply wasn't possible, so it was basically walking from there. So we all jumped out the Land Rover. It was although it was June, summer, it was an extremely wet night and extremely cold, a cold wind and very wet. And I was aware that I really just had kind of summer gear, light trousers on, a light jacket. But, I walked in, and we walked probably for at least 40 minutes uphill and quite rough terrain. And eventually I arrived at the scene, and my colleagues, who were about 10 minutes ahead of me, had very efficiently gathered all the casualties together. And the scene that I was met with was of 5 girls in their pyjamas who had been on a Duke of Edinburgh trip, from their school, an Aberdeen school, a very well-known Aberdeen school. They were on a Duke of Edinburgh trip. They'd done really well with their navigation. They'd had a long day on the hill, and they decided to camp quite high up beside a feeder burn that goes into the River Gairn. So they'd set up their tents and had their supper, got into their tents, and sadly the weather deteriorated very, very quickly and very significantly. Very torrential rain, and during the night, the river that they were camping, the burn beside, turned into a river, a torrential river, and it actually could have been very, very much more serious. It had washed through their tents and washed all the tents away, washed the gear away. And so these girls were actually awoken to find themselves submerged in very fast flowing water, with all their camping gear, everything washed away down this very fast flowing burn. So my colleagues had gathered them all together, got them into sort of group shelter, warmed them up, and there was a rescue helicopter en route very quickly because the girls had managed to give such good coordinates. So, I mean, to me, it was like sort of the cavalry arriving when the Sea King helicopter, because it was still the Sea King helicopters operational in 2005, this big yellow cavalry, it was like this arriving, and I've never been so glad to see a helicopter in my life. so it sort of loomed through the dark with its searchlights on, and I don't know what they must have thought when they put their searchlights down and saw girls in their pajamas on top of this mountainside. And so thankfully they landed very quickly, and we managed to get all 5 girls and myself. I was so relieved. I had visions that I was going to have to walk out again, feeling very, very cold myself and quite shivery. And I really thought if I have to walk out, I could get myself into serious trouble. So I was very relieved to get scooped up with the girls in their pajamas.
In the novel, the character Dr. Sophia Blake isn't so lucky. Dr. Sophia Blake watched the helicopter lift the girls away, the wind from the blades and the storm pulling through her thin spring trousers. The lights from the helicopter disappeared, and she was left on the side of the mountain, her feet slipping deeper into the mud, and the rain pushing into her face felt like little ball bearings. She had no other option but to walk. She straightened her headlamp, but before she could take her first step, she heard an engine noise over the sound of the storm. She turned. It was a Land Rover. They'd managed to make it off the track and come back for her.
Other threads that came through with the environment was isolation. Not isolation within the community, but from the rest of the world. That Braemar can be very cut off. And that's because of the environment around it, whether it's blizzards, floods, sudden changes of weather, or just sheer distance.
I mean, the snow can come just as quickly as that. And then it can be here for a few days, and the next day you get up and there's nothing left again. That's nowadays because the climate changes so quickly. That didn't happen years ago. Once the snow arrived at the end of October, it was there all the way through till April, and it didn't actually ever go away. But now we can have a storm and have loads of snow every few days, and then waking up and the temperature's changed and it's all gone again.
Some of the rescues I was on were in the thick of winter, and there's nothing more frightening than being in a total whiteout blizzard. You've got goggles on, you've got your Gore-Tex up, you've got a buff on, and it's quite difficult to breathe when you're struggling in a blizzard, and especially going uphill. And when you're on searches, as often we're spread out in a line, and you stick to your line, so you have to make sure you maintain eye contact with the people on either side of you. And I remember once on a call out to a crashed plane in the Cairngorms, we were walking uphill, and it was very bouldery and lots of snow. Because sometimes you have to navigate around rocks, big rocks that you can't walk over. You've got to walk around them. And that split second can mean that you break away from that line. And I remember that some of us managed to break away from the line, and it was the most frightening moment I've ever had. I was terrified because I thought, I have no idea where I am. I'm in the middle of a whiteout. We're on a mountain, very high avalanche risk as well, because the snow was falling very thickly. And thankfully, there was 4 of us managed to gather together. And what you do in that situation is you stay put. You don't move. You don't try and catch up. You stay put. And the person that's navigating they'll come back, gather everyone together, and find you.
In the blink of an eye, it could turn into a blizzard and you could be stuck. So one time when I was at Kirgarth School, and I would have been about 7, 8, my dad had collected this tractor from the farm below with a trailer, and he collected all the children from our end of the glen, and we all got into the trailer, and I, like a little mother hen, put my arms over the little ones, because Blindrift snow, you can't breathe in it. And it was just dinging doon. It was coming down so fast and furious. And it was a horrendous journey. We were only 2 miles, but it took us forever.
And I remember at one point we were actually snowed in for 6 weeks. And my dad and a few other of our neighbours round about, they dug a pathway up to the village, which was 3 miles away. It took them, I think, 2 weeks to do it because the snow was about 15 feet high. It was a lot taller than they were. But fortunately, in those days, we were quite prepared for it because my mum used to have sacks of oatmeal, and my grandfather kept the most wonderful vegetable garden, and all the vegetables were put in pits with straw storing over the winter. So at one time, I remember having nothing to eat except porridge and chips. And bread, of course, because my mum always had a big sack of flour and she made her own bread anyway. So I think that must have been at the time when we were cut off for the 6 weeks.
In the novel, Sophia joined Liz at the Five Arms. "A blizzard? This late in April?" asked Liz. "That's what they say. Should be starting tonight. And with the road washed out from the floods, well, prepare to hunker down," responded the doctor. Liz didn't focus on Sophia as she spoke, but instead stared out the window at the sky. She picked at the label on her bottle of beer until it looked like a cat had sharpened its claws on the IPA. Sophia reached over and put a hand on Liz's shoulder. "Don't worry. We've got each other's backs here. You won't go without. This village is quite good at making do. We've got a samba band, so you won't get bored."
So, as you can see, we're dealing with the beauty of the swirl of the rock pools and the Dee, the stag preying over the mountain, but also a danger. And that became a character within the story, a character itself, the character of the environment and the land around Braemar, and how that character of the environment interacted with the community. And it became a really strong central theme of the narrative.
For more information on the Braemarnia Project, go to braemarnia.wordpress.com. Rachel Marsh, as well as being the facilitator of this project, is an Associate Lecturer in Creative Writing with the Open University. Explore creative writing and more with the Open University. No qualifications are required for most Open University undergraduate modules, and you can enrol for one module at a time. If your personal income is £25,000 or less, you may be eligible for a part-time fee grant to cover OU course fees. The OU also offers the modules Creative Writing and Advanced Creative Writing, a BA Honours in English Literature and Creative Writing, and an MA in Creative Writing. You can try creative writing course content for free on the OU site OpenLearn, such as Writing What You Know or Start Writing Fiction. More info at www.openuniversity.co.uk/Scotland.